I would absolutely have to start with and thank my friend Sharon Mitchell because it's all her fault that we're all here. I got started in my research in Belle, Bennett about 2 years ago at 10 o'clock at night. I opened up the book Footprints that Sharon led the editing on that traced the history of African Americans in Madison County. And I was completely taken aback to open up that book.
A reflection on themselves, to have their girls or women go out from home to work for money.
He supported civil rights and church rights for both white and black women as well as black men is distinctive. I get very frustrated when folks use racist acts by saying they would just try to make it as though we should expect nothing. People are called another and we need more of ourselves than the baser instincts of our family. There is some danger in focusing on a white pillar of civil rights that will marginalize the leadership of African Americans in this. What is remarkable about Belle is a shift in humanity of others, and that allows us to embrace the whole. Her grandfather described himself as a planter and circuit riding residency. He was called John Bennett. He fell in love with a woman named Belle. is their granddaughter, Bennett, is named. Their son, Samuel Bennett, made his fortune through investments and land deals, as well as the extensive dowry of Elizabeth Ginny. And she brought a large amount of marriage. The plantation land backed up into the slave property of Madison County. And the family. So going back to the chapter, John, which the first Methodist church in Madison. Ginny, am I still on? We're afraid. I'm good. So, Belle Bennett, in her youth, became exactly what she was supposed to be. Okay. She was beautiful and charming and had plenty of money, and she was a finishing school at Madison in Barton, and then for further education in Ohio. She had 2 seasons coming out in Frankfurt and apparently made quite an impression during the season in New Orleans. A friend described Belle Harris Bennett as a young socialite. Parties, dancing, horseback riding, and other forms of gaiety became her social diversion. She was very handsome with a tall, graceful figure. This beauty, and I like this part, combined with her unusual, fascinating manner of expressing herself, made her a rare person. Somewhere in the midst of this, though, she attended evangelical meetings led by a Presbyterian minister who advocated for education for all. The minister's wife was named Sarah Speak McKee, and her husband said she was better at preaching and at church organizing than he was. Sarah McKee likely was the first woman Belle Bennett ever saw preach. And as part of their religious convictions and deepening faith, Belle and her sister Sue started thinking about what they could do to make their world better. Now, this would have been in the 1870s, after the Civil War. By the way, I just have to put aside here, Methodists are really good at splitting the denominations over social. So it's not terribly surprising that there was a denominational split over slavery that lasted about 100 years. African Methodist Episcopal churches had already long separated. And in southern states, whites took on the name, this is a mouthful, Methodist Episcopal Church South. And formerly enslaved people in 1870 took the name Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Belle and her sister Sue started visiting impoverished families in more remote parts of the county. They made friends, learned about what their lives were like, and Belle Bennett's biography says they found out what they called a community devoid of religious opportunity, because there were not schools or churches within the vicinity. Now, my good historians here know there's a lot of churches going on around there. And so I'm a little bit raising my eyebrows over that assertion in the Bible. But Mount Nebo Missionary Baptist Church didn't start services until 1901. And I'm not seeing evidence of churches in places out further in Richmond where African American Christians congregated in that region in that time. Nor from statements in the biography is it clear the racial identity of the children the Bennett visit. But we do know that they were concerned about the needs of children in economically impoverished circumstances. So they secured the right to a building beside a gristmill that was abandoned and created what they called a Sunday school.
providing both literacy and Bible lessons. Their experiences over the next few years were shaped what they imagined might be possible for their lives. In 1884, Belle also visited the Chicago Institute in New York, and she got her first education in social justice. This Gristmill school at the Chicago shaped everything that happened. They became very passionate about starting a school for mountain children, and they became leaders of Southern Methodist Church mission. But the Bennett family's life was turned upside down when their father, Samuel Bennett, died in 1888. Homestead was sold, and this house was built on Main Street. I think you're right. The Bennett sisters took up housekeeping with their mother, and they were raising money for the mountain school. They met missionaries who were returning from other countries and working in the United States, and they discovered something very important. Women at that time, of course, were not allowed in seminaries, but married or not, missionaries they were, and they were expected to lead Bible studies, take care of the sick, engage in what we would now call social work. These Methodist women said, we are being asked to do things, and we simply are not up to the task. They needed a school to train them in theology, social work, and other areas that could help them be effective. And I'm being asked, did I turn my lapel mic on? It's on. Yeah. Our friends online are not hearing us?
They were having difficulties, so.
I've never had anyone, I'm sure they could hear me from their.
Yeah, they could.
Without the mic. Usually I'm told to talk quieter. I mean, I can go a whole lot louder if you want, but they might not like it. Somebody online, tell Sharon if you can hear me. You don't mind. All right. We continuing on.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. The Northern Church, we go back. They needed a school to train them in theology, social work, and other things that they needed to be effective. Now, the Northern Church reluctantly allowed, and reluctantly is the word here, women to serve as deacons, starting in 1888. But the South had no such version. The idea of Protestant deaconesses had been around Europe for a half century. But here's the basic idea. Women received a small stipend, which importantly separated them from Catholic nuns. And they were supported by the church to serve as teachers, nurses, and social workers. Now, the Methodist didn't do anything like that. On top of it, church women did not have full rights of membership. No matter how large their contributions were, either financial or by labor, they were not allowed to vote in church or denominational meetings. In the cult of true womanhood, women were discouraged from expressing ideas even amongst themselves. Up to this point, Belle Bennett had been operating quietly behind the scenes. It was perceived as highly unladylike to put forth a plan of action, much less ask money. That took more courage than she believed that she could. Nonetheless, she got on the train to Little Rock in 1889 and went to a meeting of the Southern Methodist Women's Board of Regents. She was so frightened and intimidated she could barely stand. So somebody brought her a chair so that she could speak. And they encouraged her. She said, women long to work in the Lord's vineyard, but could not because they did not know how to work. She found her voice, and it was heard by Eva Case Scarrett, the wife of a prominent Methodist minister, and perhaps more importantly, a wealthy land developer. The Scarrets put up front money. The mission board said, this is a great idea. And we think, Belle, you should be the chief fundraiser. Belle apparently found her voice and she probably was standing up at that point because we know she said, I don't know how to do this. And that board looked at her and said, we think you do. Belle Bennett went across the country by herself. That's an important point here at that time, raising funds for the school. And she took a rare step for women at the time. She spoke from the pulpit. One biographer said she was so forceful and appealing that prejudice gave place to appreciation. And after she spoke, they crowded forward, men, women, and children with gifts great and small, pouring out their treasures. The Scarrett School opened in 1892 in Kansas City. You see here the graduating class from 2 years later. Curriculum included church history, history of missions, religious pedagogy, methods of social work, phonetics, hymnology, bookkeeping. Isn't that an interesting combination? Among the first graduates was Miss Leona Glenn, who was sent to Brazil, remember that in a minute, to serve as a missionary where she served for 40 years. Belle was deep in the work for the Scarrett School when another tragedy struck the Bennett family. Sue, her older sister, had been advocating again for this school for mountain children, and she unexpectedly died. Belle was crushed. Once the Kansas City Mission School was fully launched, she went out to carry her sister's vision to fruition. She traveled, as one did at that time on horseback, across 10 counties to find a site for the school. Everybody wanted it, but nobody could put up the front money to match funds from the Women's Mission Board in order to sustain it. Laurel County was considered a very progressive community for its time, and the business community leaders of London, Kentucky, matched the $20,000 already funded by Kentucky Methodist women. First, the school served elementary age children as a boarding school, and eventually it became a college. Over the next century, it served 11,000 students. In 1897, Bill's mother died, and her brother got the house. The current owners of the Bennett house let me and Jackie Kuchar come in and take pictures of her trunk. I was so excited. Jackie literally practically had to staple me to the floor. Belle managed to come up with a way to maintain her independence. She moved into the Glendon Hotel and rented a small suite, which she redecorated with a large Chanel family 4-poster canopy and somewhere around 40 pieces of art from her friends. We know one of the women who served with her went in and counted one day. She was able to fund all of the many places she went by renting out her suite when she was away. Travel she did. From 1896 until her death in 1922, she was president of, really long, the Southern Methodist Women's Board of the Home Missions Society, which in the middle of somewhere reorganized an independent group as the Women's Missionary Council. She was instrumental in raising funds for schools, including a medical school for women in Shanghai, to the first girls' college in Brazil, which is named Bennett College. During this time period, we need to see her work as part of the larger arts and crafts movement. social justice, social gospel, a self-sufficiency, which was a direct response from rapid industrialization. Settlement houses serving urban poor started in England, but most well-known in the United States is the Hull House in Chicago. When Asian Americans came in increasing numbers to the Pacific Rim and Latin and Caribbean immigrants to the Gulf Coast, the Women's Missionary Society under her leadership opened schools and clinics with their transition. Her big project, many of the women trained at Scarrett would go on to work at the Wesley, I don't know why I said Wesley. Anyway, Wesley houses and Bethlehem centers. The council set up more than 40 centers from Florida to California. They resembled those settlement houses in Chicago. She had hoped that the early Wesley centers would be integrated. But between Jim Crow and the high level of distrust going on cross-culturally amongst a lot of groups, there really was a challenge because the Wesley houses were only serving white immigrant families. With the help of funds from the missionary council, a new center was formed. Fisk University over there, Sally Hill Sawyer, the Scarrett School to send workers and create a house for African Americans, and they were the Bethlehem. The Colored Methodist Church had been offering community centers for more than a decade, but they believed work should be done. And this partnership was absolutely significant. But the Wellesley community houses served white people in urban areas, and the Bethlehem community houses served both provided literacy classes, daycare, work training, Bible study, recreation, and other programs. Critics didn't seem to pay too much attention when Wesley houses worked with poor white people. But they got really nasty letters concerning the Bethlehem houses. Belle Bennett told her staff, don't widely publicize that we're getting these racist letters that were on and they were condemning their work. In fact, what she would do is gather up all of the nasty letters and say, what do you mean? I never told anything. It worked at that time. I thought I did something wrong with the mic, sorry. Belle, I think all of this study, yeah. For some reason, my computer decided to share the stage. Okay. Belle Bennett's ideas about justice extended beyond raising money. And while president of the Southern Methodist Women's Missionary Council, she took a hard stand against lynching. And she encouraged other church women to do the same. She publicly supported Ida B. Wells' campaign. We could talk a long time about all the Clay sisters' views on African Americans and suffrage. That's another paper. We do need to at least say that Sally Clay Bennett, who was also with Kathy Clay's daughter, who was married to Belle Bennett's brother, wrote personal letters and suffrage newspaper articles that African American men were instigators of the violence against them. I believe that created a serious rift in the Bennett family, but I have limited documentation. We do know Belle Bennett powerfully urged women, unquote, to state disapproval and abhorrence to the savagery that promotes the crime of lynching by tongue and by pen. Now, her words carried some weight within women's circles. That didn't happen in her church. She wasn't allowed to speak at the Southern Methodist General Conference until 1910. And she pleaded eloquently to give women laity rights. She backed up her speech with a 24-page pamphlet, an outline of the worldwide movement for the liberation of women. And she traced women's rights across history. She systematically made her case, quoting Sir William Blackstone's English common law, John Stuart Mill's advocacy for women in the British Parliament, Hebrew, Islamic, and Hindu scriptures. Remember, it went on for 22 pages. She had a lot of that. She said that the injustice of unequal pay for women in factories worldwide led to a poverty of mind and body. And it is on this point that she specifically identified class and race-based differences. She said, the 7 million women who work 10, 12, and 14 hours a day in shop, mill, office, and school with scant wages or salaries, living in wretched tenements, want and desire a voice. Women of wealth, in their ease of comfort, can say, we have all the rights we want. The ballot would force us additional responsibility for which we have neither time nor desire. These women are not heartless, only self-centered. Her pamphlet makes the radical association that the so-called movement for liberation and uplift of women is the result of the teachings of Jesus. She used biblical authority to challenge the prevailing interpretation of scripture, mandating women's meekness and silence. She charged that women, particularly church women, must fight injustice when they encounter it. So the work they did was not only good for those they served, but created opportunities for them to live fuller lives. Women, she said, can combat injustices that were brought about by the Industrial Revolution. She called for better conditions for immigrants, the work hour to be limited to 10-hour shifts. She condemned the misuse of child labor and said it caused illiteracy. She said church women were already organized in local societies. They just needed the authority, the recognition from the church in order to actually do the job. Other women in the United States, other denominations, other parts of Europe granted women recognition so they might be good. Why not Methodists in the South? Despite her impassioned plea, her efforts to gain laity rights were successful in 1910. And in response to suffragists' inroads into denominational politics, the men and religion forward movement gained strength in an effort to prevent the over-feminization of Protestant churches. She tried for 8 years to get women's voices heard within the denomination. And even when that happened and women were granted laity rights, Kentucky voted against it. Mm-hmm. But the rest of the country said okay. So she worked for both the women's right to vote in churches, and she made a direct connection between the sacred and the secular. In 1912, need to jump ahead here. There we go. I'll jump back. She started a 2-year stint serving on the Kentucky Equal Rights Executive Committee. She sent in a news comment to the Women's Journal saying, much work is being done in the South. men and women are reading and talking in favor of suffrage as never before. That year at the Midwestern Suffrage Conference in Chicago, Laura Clay, Justice Clay's daughter, spoke on stage right. Belle Bennett spoke on church work. A year later, Laura Clay was speaking against suffrage because African Americans might get the vote. Belle Bennett spoke in favor of suffrage. Forgive me, I'm going to go back here too. Perhaps some of her greatest and most groundbreaking work happened in her hometown. So in order to shift to what she did in Richmond, I'm going to jump back in time to around 1800. She was very discouraged by the limits being placed on her by men's denominations. So she redirected her focus from missions worldwide, particularly Africa, to supporting African Americans at home. She met with African American preachers and their wives in Richmond, people she had long known, to talk about the challenges that they were facing. At the request of the pastor A.W. Jackson, Belle and Bennett and Mary Rourke, who was the second president of Eastern Kentucky University, they began to teach Bible at St. Paul AME. Reports indicate over the next few years, it went from a handful of people showing up to 500 or more. That was, it stuns me. Black Church Missionary Society and the African Methodist Episcopal Churches, Holland Christian Endeavor League, they all invited her to speak. And these meetings gave her new insight, as well as the motivation to teach white women about racial justice. In May of 1901, while she was in St. Louis, she was still kind of afraid of this. And she was very hesitant to begin talking about racial justice to white congregations, because she said social tensions, racial tensions were too high. According to her biographer, she felt prejudice must die down somewhat before it was feasible. Finally, in answer to an argument that prejudice would die sooner if somebody would fight against it, she turned to God for guidance. There were three who prayed that afternoon in the upper room, and light was given. When the prayers ended, she rose from her knees and said, "We will begin tomorrow morning." And so she did. She passionately spoke the next day at a wealthy white congregation in St. Louis and laid out the truth. African Americans, particularly African American women, had not received opportunities for education, but instead had been forced into menial jobs taking care of white families. Those church members paid forward in droves and made denominations in the names of the Black women who would nurse them and their children. In a single day, a third of the money needed to support the HBCU King College in Augusta, Georgia, came through. The first women's dormitory built was named Bennett Hall. Now, I have to include that her biography does include some paternalistic language concerning her relationship with African Americans in Richmond. And her speeches for and about African Americans kind of weave one sentence that generalizes bad character and completely ignores the powerful Black community and Black churches. With another sentence that was blatantly racist, with another sentence that was radically progressive for her time. She said again and again in her speeches, though, race prejudice can only be overcome by divine grace. And she urged her audience to be gentle in dealing with those who do not do this work as we do ourselves. Back in Richmond, her commitment to support African Americans in her own community was significant. She worked with Henry Allen Lane and other African American leaders to establish what became called the Colored People's Chicago of Madison County. She served as the Chicago president for 3 years. The first 5-day event included speakers W.E.B. Du Bois and George Washington Carver. Yes, they came to Richmond. Efforts were made to create a rope barrier between 1,500 African Americans who came, some 25 whites in the audience. Belle Bennett took over. She later wrote that some of her friends and even family were so impressed with the success of the Chicago that they had almost forgotten that they wholly disapproved of the enterprise. The final Chicago occurred a few months after she died. She was memorialized in the Unity service, honoring her memory beside two prominent African Americans who had also recently their needs for Unity service at the bottom. Richmond First Baptist, Reverend Roberts, and St. Paul AME's Reverend Frost. A night of great and stirring sermons. 2 years before her death, she organized an event that had profound impact on the early stirrings of the civil rights movement. Making real change in Southern society required intersectional partnerships. And under her leadership, the Women's Missionary Council created the Commission on Race Relations in 1920. And the steps for a collaborative partnership were put in place, but the level of distrust between Black and white leaders of women's community groups was intense. The Black women thought that the white women really wanted advice on hiring domestic. An organizing conference was held for this group in Memphis. There were 100 white women attending. Some of them may have been unaware of the purpose of the meeting because they were members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. 4 African American women from the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs were invited to speak, including the wife of Washington, Margaret Murray. Tensions were very high, particularly as these 4 African American women walked into the room. But Belle Bennett rose and began singing, "Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love." All the women in the room rose to her feet and joined her. The tone of the event immediately changed, and African American speakers said that the environment that started to take place there allowed them to feel safe enough to tell their stories. Charlotte Hawkins Brown described being forcibly removed from a Pullman car on her way to this Memphis conference, a car that some of the white women in the audience had also been riding. The audience wept at her experience, went home promising to get to know their African American neighbors and join efforts lynching and other oppression. Charlotte Hawkins Brown later described the meeting as the greatest step forwards to the emancipation. The Reverend William Alexander, an African American minister who helped organize that conference, said, "White women's church groups became the most effective force in changing Southern racial climates. The white women had discovered that the problems African American women faced had something to do with themselves, and they were in a position to do something." One of Bennett's contemporaries described her strong stand for right and justice aroused the women of the Southern Methodist Church until they have become the leaders of the interracial work of the South. This movement forward must be attributed to Miss Bennett's vision and leadership. As she worked for women's right to vote, again, she made a connection between raising consciousness about women's rights in the church and women's political rights. Again, unlike other Southern suffragists, she wanted the vote for both white and Black women. Using of the 19th Amendment was a political and religious venture. The opening of the country's political leadership for women opened the door for women's leadership in the church. For Belle, the two things went hand in hand. And she laid a significant part of the foundation for what would become my religious order of lay order of deaconesses and home missioners. Our covenant is to serve through love, justice, and service. She was too ill to attend the Southern Methodist Denominations Conference in 1922, which was also the first time women delegates were included. She was living with her niece, Annie Bennett Collins, and she died that year. Here you can see the house where she died on Lancaster Avenue. And the Bennett family marker is among the largest in the Richmond Cemetery. Up until the last year of her life, she served as a trusted liaison between Richmond's Black community and Whitehouse administrators. There was a bond issued to repair the segregated white school building, high school building following a fire. And she insisted that the Black school be upgraded too. Reverend Broadus reported there was some delay in getting the work underway at the colored school. And in the meantime, Miss Bennett died. But she made a provision in her last will and testament to take care of these improvements at the colored school in the event that the school board failed to keep faith with the school board did keep. I will close with this, in what would have been her last coherent address to the Women's Missionary Council. She said, "Let the future bring what it may. The field is wide, the need is great. God loves us. Let us do the work He is committed to." Thank you.